you can imagine that the sausage itself, if you like, very open a pen, right, is like this. If you actually took a cross section, okay, where we have our little sort of gut tube through the middle. What happens is that the sausage is actually hollowed out in the middle, and you've got sort of two spaces at either side running through the sausage. And in fact, what you've got are two little hollow tubes running throughout the length of the embryo. Okay, so when you actually look at it in cross section here. So I hope you understand that this picture here, when you take a slice through the middle of the embryo, then what you will see is that the gut tube is in the middle, okay? The part that will eventually form the nervous system is towards the posterior part. And at this cross-section, the anterior part is going to be forming the heart. But basically, what we've got is an almost hollowed out centre of our sort of fetus, if you like. And these two areas here are lined by what's eventually going to be the peritoneum. Okay. And what we have here, this is a little model of our cross-section of our embryo, okay, representing this idea. This outside ring will represent the abdominal wall. So we've got anterior abdominal wall, lateral, posterior abdominal wall, etc. So that's that bit in the middle. Okay. Let's say lining the inside of the abdomen is the peritoneum. Okay. But the actual sort of peritoneum is in two half moon shapes, as we saw there. And the effect of it will be that you have a dorsal and a ventral mesentery, as they're called, where basically these two parts of the peritoneum sort of get glued together at the front and at the back. And the gut tube in the middle is literally sandwiched between the two sheets. Okay, and we'll develop. Okay, so that's looking at it from above. That's what we have there. Okay. It's basically that. Okay, so I've just taken a longitudinal section of the gut tube. This model will actually represent, we've got the anterior abdominal wall here, posterior abdominal wall here, okay, with our ventral mesentery and our dorsal mesentery, and our gut tube running longitudinally through the middle. Now, that's all right, get my colours right there. Different parts of the gut tube, okay, will eventually swell and twist to form different parts of the GI tract. Okay, now it's colour-coded for easy reference, so hopefully you understand the progressive models. Now the upper part of the gut tube will eventually become the stomach. I have got it in there. Right, I've got my gut tube has fallen in the wrong way around the stomach. The upper part will eventually swell and become the stomach. The middle part will form the small intestine, and the lower part will form the large intestine. Okay, so that's our starting point. This is very early on in the development of the embryo. Parts of the embryo parts of the gut tube will start to swell and will start to form buds and projections. Okay, so that our stomach is one of the first parts to begin developing. Okay, as is the liver and the pancreas, which are these two little buds here. So that what we actually have is that we have our stomach swelling up. From the section that will become the small intestine, okay, we have two little buds, one going off to the front and one going off to the back. Just don't forget that in this position, that's how we're orientated at the moment. Now, the little bud that shoots off to the front towards the anterior abdominal wall, that will eventually become the liver and the gallbladder and part of the pancreas. Okay? And the little bud that comes out to the back will form the rest of the pancreas. Okay. Now at some stage we've got one half of the pancreas around the front here and one half of the pancreas around the back. Then the two halves have got to join together. Okay. And the joining together, as everything turns around to join the two parts of that pancreas together, is what initiates an awful lot of the rotation of the GI tract. Okay. But this part here is the anterior abdominal wall still, and this is our posterior abdominal wall. Okay. Now we have our gut tube as I say, was initially in a straight line, but now we can see that the stomach is swelling quite a bit more, and the gut tube itself is starting to kink towards the anterior abdominal wall. Okay. Now our little bud that was out the front that was going to form the liver has actually grown an awful lot, and the little bud eventually forms the bile tube. It swells even more within the two halves of the peritoneum to form the liver, and we get a specific little offshoot there, which is the anterior part of the pancreas. Okay, and our posterior part of the pancreas is still just a little bit of the bud around the back here. Okay. Now, what I will say at this point is, at the moment we've got, well, this is where I'm very on the next pair of hands. We've got a large sheet of the mesentery still in the front, and this is what remains of the sheet of mesentery at the back. Okay. Now, eventually, if you can just hold that bit there, eventually parts of the gut will start to turn, and what has to happen is that a lot of this part of the ventral mesentery has to disintegrate so that things have space to turn around. Okay, otherwise it really does get very convoluted with too many pieces of fascia. So what actually happens is that as the development is getting to this stage, you will get a hole appearing in the ventral mesentery, and where I've got the dotted line all along there, that will eventually disintegrate. Okay, but I'll come to that a bit more a little bit later on. Now, what happens at this stage is that the two parts of the pancreas have to join up, and what will happen along a superior inferior or sort of vertical axis, you will get a rotation. Okay, and what will happen is that as the duodenum, if you like, will rotate, this part of the pancreas here will eventually come around to join the back part of the pancreas. Okay, now I'm just going to pop up another OHP there. What we've been looking at the moment is that this is our, looking from the top view, we've got our gut tube, and we've got our posterior pancreatic bud and our anterior pancreatic bud. Okay, and what will happen is that around the longitudinal axis around the gut tube, we will get a rotation. Okay, and so the anterior bud of the pancreas eventually comes around and joins the back part of the pancreas there. Okay, this is represented by picture number 3. So if you can hold that in. What actually happens is that, so this part will eventually collapse right around and join up at the back. Okay, so you end up, yeah, okay, yeah. So you end from yeah. What happens is that the anterior part will come around the side of the duodenum and join together at the back. Okay, so immediately what we've got is a rotation in this direction. Okay, now as the pancreas is joined together, what happens is that the rest of the gut will start to follow. Okay, so that once we've got rotation going there, okay, we can see that in effect everything is going to be twisting that way. Now don't forget that the anterior and posterior abdominal walls stay static, okay? As the gut will rotate like that, what will happen is that the stomach will begin to swing out this side, and the liver bud will begin to swing out that way, okay? See it from the front.
Liver on the right-hand side.
Okay, so when the embryo is very young, I say that the stomach and the liver are in line in this direction, but obviously in the adult you'll find that the stomach is going to be on this side and the liver is on this side, and the way that it gets there is by following the rotation of the duodenum as the two parts of the pancreas come together. Okay? Alright, so if you want to see that in the back, we'll come around to the next stage. From the above, it's going to be easier for me to hold up this, and this is our anterior abdominal wall. If you can just hold the bottom bit for me, that's it. Okay, we have our stomach, which started out there and has now come around to the side. Okay, we have our liver, which started out in that direction, but has now, in following the rotation of the duodenum and the two bits of the pancreas, has come out that way. And this part represents the anterior abdominal wall. So you begin to see that, if you can hold that bit there. so that we can begin to see, if I can just hold it in line, the organs are beginning to take their normal adult position. So they've gone from there to there, okay, with the stomach being on the left and the liver on the right. Okay, now, one thing you will also, or may well have found out from your anatomy text at the moment, is the duodenum itself is stuck to the posterior abdominal wall. It's actually retroperitoneal, which means it should be glued to the back. Okay. Now at the moment, as we can see, it's floating free, basically. If you can hang on to that bit there. If we look from, this is looking from the right side, okay, what will happen is that we've had the rotation of the duodenum and the two parts of the pancreas have actually come together over here, and that's the bile duct that's been sort of dragged around. Okay, what happens next is that as the liver and the stomach are carrying on following the rotation round, the duodenum comes from its sort of looking forward position, and it actually will begin to rotate around the side, and eventually it comes back and back and back until it touches the posterior abdominal wall and eventually will fuse there. Okay. Now, whereas in this position it's covered completely on both sides by the peritoneum, and also is, as is the posterior abdominal wall and the lateral abdominal wall. What will happen as the two parts come together, they get stuck together, and the peritoneum in between will basically disintegrate, and that's how it will become retroperitoneal in the adult. Okay. And so those dotted lines there just represent the two parts of the peritoneum that will eventually disappear. Okay. As the gut starts to develop further, all right, we had the duodenum bulging anteriorly to begin with, but what is also happening at the same time is that the lower part of the gut tube, the small intestine and the large intestine, also starts to bulge anteriorly and form a big long loop towards the umbilicus. Okay. And in fact, what happens is that the loop bulges so far forward that it actually bulges through the umbilicus, and part of the rotation of the gut tube actually will be occurring within the umbilical tube itself. Okay, so if you can imagine there's basically a great big hole in the anterior abdominal wall, and this bulge will literally go through it.
Where the yolk's at?
It is, yeah. Okay, and a lot of that rotation will be occurring sort of through in the yolks, within the umbilical tube, get the words out, and then it will eventually have to come back out of there and come back towards the posterior abdominal wall. Now, for simplicity's sake, all right, I haven't got an umbilical tube, right? So our rotation is going to be all within the abdomen. But what happens in any case is that for this part of the gut tube to start twisting and rotating, okay, the large hole in the anterior mesentery has had to appear in order that this can rotate without getting sort of too convoluted and caught up. Okay, so what actually then will occur is that the remnants of the ventral mesentery here is what eventually will form the falciform ligament in the adult. Okay, it's just to orientate your anatomy a little bit more, so that as the hole appears, what's left attached to the anterior abdominal wall and the liver is what's going to be the falciform ligament. Okay, just to name a couple of other ligaments while we're here. Eventually, the part of the mesentery that is left between the liver and the stomach is what's going to be called the lesser omentum. Okay. Now, the greater omentum itself, if I can just have you holding that bit there. All right. The greater omentum is formed, okay, I'll just poke all that back in, from the dorsal mesentery, sort of behind the stomach. Okay. Now, if we remember that the stomach started pointing directly anterior, and now it is basically rotating so that its back half is coming out towards the right. What will happen is that the mesentery here will start to bulge out in response to that sort of rotation. Okay, so you can imagine that what's helping the stomach to come right around is basically a great big sort of hand bulging the peritoneum like that. Right. Now eventually this bulge becomes so big that it can flop right over the front of the stomach and down over the rest of the intestines, and that is what actually forms the greater omentum. Okay, and I've got a bit more of a picture of that, or model of that, in a minute.
Did any of you see Frank Willard's Lectures. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Okay. So, at this stage, what we've now got is that our duodenum has come back towards our posterior abdominal wall. If you could just hold that a little bit there. We have our stomach has come very much more to the person's left-hand side, or to the fetus's left-hand side, and the liver has come very much more to the fetus's left-hand side. Okay, but the rest of the gut tube is actually still pointing towards the anterior abdominal wall and the umbilicus. Okay, so that's our position for our next model, if you like. Okay. Has anyone got any questions so far? Good. Looking at here is the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, if you can just hold that a little bit there. Okay.
Can you see?
No, that's okay. Okay. Right, we ignore that bit just for a moment. What we have is our posterior abdominal wall. Okay. Our stomach has come right around to the right side. And what happened was that a hand came right behind the back of the stomach and made a huge big bulge in the peritoneum, in the remnants of the dorsal mesentery there, and eventually that's how the greater omentum forms. Okay, so the greater omentum itself, as I say, is double layer like that. It comes from the greater curvature of the stomach, I can't get the words out, but it also comes from the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, so the two parts of it, that's it, the two attachments of the greater omentum. All right. Now, if I can just retrieve my hand. In the adult, what you'll have is a thing, the opening to the greater omentum is a thing called the epiploic foramen. All right. And it seems to be sort of quite confusing to actually sort of find out where it is. But what's happened is that, if you remember, we've taken off our piece that represented the anterior abdominal wall, and we've taken off a little bit of peritoneum that represented the falciform ligament. And our liver has carried on curling much more and more and more towards the baby's right-hand side. And what happens is eventually it will get stuck to the posterior abdominal wall in this area. Okay. And if I can just for the moment show that the bare area that is not covered by peritoneum in the liver, which you'll come to when you do it with your anatomy, is just formed by, again, in the same manner as with the duodenum, the part of the liver that contacts the posterior abdominal wall disintegrates, and that's what forms the bare surface of the liver. Okay, but that's, again, a point for your anatomy. But what happens is that the little bile tube in the middle doesn't actually get stuck down to the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, that bit stays free, and that little entrance in there is what's called the epiploic foramen, which is the entrance to the greater omentum. Okay, so what we actually have now, we're basically moving on to the rest of our intestines, the small and the large intestines. Okay, this is our posterior abdominal wall, and our intestines have swelled out very much towards the umbilicus, and in fact what will happen is that my arms in effect will represent the entrance to the umbilicus, and that's the umbilical tube, and a lot of rotation will recur through there, and eventually the whole lot will then settle back down onto the posterior abdominal wall to find its normal adult resting place. Okay. So, the piece that's represented by blue is what's eventually going to be the small intestine, and this is the large intestine, or the colon. Okay?
Blue, essentially the gut.
Yes. And green, sort of pine gut. That's right. Okay. Now, this part of the, all this peritoneum here are what's left of the dorsal mesentery. Okay? Don't forget that the only bit that's now left of the ventral mesentery is the bit that is attacking the liver down to the anterior abdominal wall. Okay, so that's what's left of the ventral mesentery. All this was formed from the ventral mesentery, but the actual peritoneum that's left here is formed by the dorsal mesentery. Okay, if anyone is sort of confused about that, I'll come back to one of the other models just to run through that again. Okay. So what we actually have now is that our starting position is here, and you will get an anti-clockwise rotation like this. Okay? But basically, the large intestine will come towards the person's left-hand side. It will go over the top of the small intestine and flop down the other side. Okay? Now, the axis of rotation that is occurring here, I don't think I ought to turn a little bit more to the side there. The axis as it rotates is along the middle, indicated by this piece of string. Okay. Now, this piece of string basically is the position of the superior mesenteric artery. Okay. Now, I just want to pop up another OHP. Okay, so this first picture here will represent the yellow dashes are what's left of the dorsal mesentery. Okay, when we have our stomach, and this is our what's eventually going to be our large intestine, and that bit is eventually what's going to be our small intestine. And the axis about which it rotates is the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, as is explained in that picture there. Okay, and you can see that the superior mesenteric artery actually got in towards the gut tube by looking at this picture here. This is where we looked at right at the beginning. This area is what's going to be the spinal cord eventually. Okay, and between the two layers of peritoneum, we have the dorsal aorta sends up a little branch that then contacts the gut tube. So of course, every time the gut tube will turn, it will drag the arteries with it. Okay. Right, so what we've had is that around our superior mesenteric artery, our gut tube is rotated like that. Okay, now, as it's rotating, the small intestine represented by the blue starts to become very much more elongated and convoluted. Okay, and this eventually, what we get is that as the whole thing rotates, the small intestine gathers itself up and gets exceedingly convoluted and begins to appear like that. All right. Now, all this sort of spare mesentery in the middle gets sort of gathered up. Okay. Let's do a quick bit of gathering. Okay. So as it's all finally rotated around, our small intestine is like this, and our large intestine is beginning to look a little bit more like as it is in the adult. But it's still all floating free. None of this is tacked down yet. But what happens now is that it's all been rotating in the umbilical tube, and it starts to retract back towards the posterior abdominal wall. And basically, this little convoluted area of all that spare mesentery that's been gathered up, basically that root of that, if you like, will actually come back and tack itself down to the posterior abdominal wall. And it tacks itself down in a little line represented by this. Okay, so in the adult, the root of the mesentery, where all this blue small intestine is tacked down, is going to be over the last part of the duodenum, part of the inferior vena cava there, the psoas muscle, and on down in towards the lateral pelvic wall. Okay, so that actually gets tacked down there. Now at this stage, a lot of the large intestine is still floating free. What will happen is that this part where the small intestine joins the large intestine is called the cecum. Okay, that is going to be on the person's right hand side, and it's going to be in this position, right in their sort of right iliac fossa, like. Okay, this part then is the ascending colon. This part will be the transverse colon, and this part will be the descending colon and the sigmoid. Okay. And what actually happens now is that parts of the colon will actually tack down to the posterior abdominal wall, but not all of it. Okay. Now, eventually, in the adult, the ascending colon and the descending colon will become tacked down and joined to the posterior abdominal wall. So what actually happens is that this bit of mesentery that's left, okay, as the small intestine has tacked itself down to the posterior abdominal wall, this part of the mesentery in here will actually get tacked down, and this part, if we move our greater momentum out of the way a minute, this part here will get tacked down. So we get two areas either side which actually get tacked down. Now if I can just pop up another OHP here. These are normally the pictures that you see in the books, this style of picture in order to indicate the rotation of the GI tract. Okay? What's happened now is that the small intestine has become very convoluted and the large intestine is all the way around the side. Okay, so that picture there, I'm just going to expand on a little bit more.
Convoluted because it's increased in length. The only way it can occupy a small space is to become convoluted.
Okay, so I'll move that down a little bit. The time scale that we're actually talking about at the moment with all this gut rotation is that is 10 weeks. You will have a lot of convoluted small intestine and the large intestine will almost be fully rotated right around. Okay, so that's just the time scale that we're talking about. Now what actually happens, as I say, that I've cut this picture here, the small intestine has been cut off to make it clear. Alright? And the spare mesentery around the outside there, on either side, gets tacked down. Okay, so that we can see that the descending colon on this side and the ascending colon on that side will basically become stuck to the posterior abdominal wall. And in the adult, they really don't move very much at all. Okay, basically they're sort of two arms stuck down onto the posterior abdominal wall. But we can see that the spare mesentery along the top isn't actually going to be joined at all, okay? And that explains why the transverse colon is left sagging, okay, in the middle. Okay. So just if I just grab that one a minute. So just to really make the point, what happens is that part of the colon will tap down all along there between those two rings. It will get tacked down. Okay, and it will get stuck at that point. Alright, this side, as I say, does exactly the same. What's left in the middle is the transverse colon. Okay, and the spare bit of peritoneum, this spare bit of peritoneum is the root of the transverse colon. Okay, now in the adult, or you know, as the baby sort of develops, the transverse colon just sags down. Okay, and we can see that this sagging of the transverse colon is what gives the shape to the two flexures of the colon in the adult. So on this side we have the hepatic flexure because it happens to be underneath the liver, and on the other side, on the person's left-hand side, we have what's known as a splenic flexure, which is just below the spleen. Okay, and just to orientate you a little bit more, the spleen itself, I can kind of turn it a little bit. The spleen itself just develops as a little swelling in the peritoneum or in the remnants of the dorsal mesentery at the back of the stomach. So it's not actually attached to much apart from by blood vessels, but the spleen itself will start to form as a little swelling, but it rapidly becomes a very much bigger swelling. Okay, but it never gets quite as big as the liver. So what happens is that there's basically more space on this half of the embryo, and so in the adult, the splenic flexure can actually sort of tack itself up much higher, so that the space occupied by the splenic flexure is here, whereas lower down, because the liver is in the way, the hepatic flexure is that much more low down. Okay. Right. And when we actually come to consider, that's a bit there, being a very, very good posterior abdominal wall here. When we come to consider what happens with the sigmoid colon, okay, I haven't got so much foam to represent it here, but basically when the descending colon has tapped down fully to the left side of the embryo, on the left side of the posterior abdominal wall, there is still a section of colon that is not fully tapped down, okay, but it hasn't got nearly so much spare mesentery, okay, but that slight sort of bulging and floppiness there is what eventually will become the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum obviously is right down at the bottom. Now sometimes in some people this part of the colon, the sigmoid colon, can be quite lengthy and convoluted, so although I've got it represented here as a very small bulge, sometimes you can get quite a long length of sigmoid colon buckled up and that's in place in the left iliac fossa there. And that's about it, I think, for the rotation of the GI tract. Yes? Oh, yeah, exactly. Sorry, yeah, put it on myself. And what eventually happens is when all our guts are in place, the greater momentum that came from the back of our stomach falls right down and covers the whole lot. And that is what you've got left in the actual left.
When you look at dissection, if they take off the skin and to the back of what first come across is this. And they have to put that half away so they can get
to all the rest of it.
To all the intestines.
Beg your pardon? Yes. Now, yes, certainly it does come from the left-hand side. But what happens really once the stomach has come out to the side here, okay, and the liver has gone to that side there? What begins to happen is that the stomach, as it grows more, eventually will sort of elongate down here. So the liver comes a wee bit higher, and the stomach will sort of drop down a little bit lower. But basically, the stomach here, it will sort of rotate itself around in order to form its nice curve, so that the greater momentum, or wherever it's sort of stuck more veering off to the side. By the time the baby is born, the stomach can sag enough for that part to be here, and so it looks as though it comes from the middle and just drops down. Okay, but as I say, it's a double blind sapping effect. Part of the front part comes from the lower end of the stomach, but the back part comes from the where the dorsal mesentery arose from the posterior abdominal wall in the first place. Okay, and ends up like that. Anyone else got any other queries?
So the greater momentum comes from the dorsal mesentery.
Yeah. Well, I'll just come back to this model for a moment, all right? This is before the stomach's turned at all, okay? This is the ventral mesentery, okay? All of this and all the swelling of the liver occurs in the ventral mesentery. And this here is the dorsal mesentery, okay? Are we happy with that?
It's difficult because, as Caroline showed, everything was actually happening like that.
In this plane, okay?
Right.
So what happens then, as I say, is that as the stomach, as the stomach starts to turn here, basically the dorsal